Hello, welcome to PCAP's Prairie's Got the Goods Week. My name is Caitlin Morose, and I am the Stewardship Coordinator with Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or PCAP. This week, we have a series of webinars going on about ecological goods and services provided by Native Prairie. Today, Karen Raven, Alberta Agriculture and Forestry, will be talking about a multi-stakeholder GIS based approach to support land use decision making. Check out other events going on this week. Tomorrow, Friday, March 23rd, Kelly Williamson with SODCAP will be talking about multi-species results-based conservation. And you can register for that webinar on the PCAP website. Check out the PCAP Facebook page or Twitter for some cool facts and resources about ecological goods and services. I would like to take a moment to note that financial support for today's webinar is provided by Environment and Climate Change Canada, Wildlife Habitat Canada, and the Saskatchewan Cattlemen's Association. A reminder to all of our listeners out there, if you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to type it into the questions section of the webinar dashboard at any time during the webinar. Questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. And now a bit about our presenter. Karen was raised on a ranch in the southern interior of BC, where she gained her love of the land. She has her Bachelor's of Natural Resource Science from Thompson Rivers University and a Master's of Science in Rangeland Resources from Oregon State University. Karen is the manager of the Land Use Unit in the Environmental Stewardship branch of Alberta Agriculture and Forestry. Her work focuses on support to the Land Use Framework regional planning initiatives, ecosystem services, agricultural sustainability initiatives, conservation offsets, and biodiversity. Grassland conservation and stewardship on working landscapes are close to her heart and drive her collaborative efforts with others. Karen is the current chair of the Alberta Prairie Conservation Forum. With that, I'd like to turn it over to you, Karen.
Great, thank you very much. All right, I will just start the slideshow, and I just want to say thank you very much to everyone for joining. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about some projects that have just been very interesting to our group, and I just really appreciate the opportunity that I can share those with you. So the projects I'm going to talk about, while it might be my name here at the bottom, they're very much collaborative and with multiple contributors. So I'll just talk individually about each of these three projects, two which look at the multi-stakeholder approach with a prioritization tool, as well as the State of the Prairie Collaborative project that's been led through the Prairie Conservation Forum, as well as Alberta Agriculture, Forestry, and Environment and Parks. So with these tools, they really help support transparency, consistency, and efficiency in decision-making, making effective use, if you will, of funding for desired outcomes, and being able to utilize existing data and expertise, and really reflecting the goals and input of the stakeholders. And it really helps through these visual results provide a common understanding of what the priorities are. So we'll start with the Southeast Alberta Conservation Offset Pilot, and the names at the bottom of the presentation, those were our pilot team, again, very much a collaborative effort, and we were initially engaged in our ministry to undertake this project as a way to look at what is feasibility of conservation offsets in Alberta, and to focus in southern Alberta, as that was the regional plan that was being worked on at the time. So the offset pilot area, just to give some context, is down in the very southeast part of Alberta in the dry and moist mixed grass. And I'll just use my cursor if you can see that. So this purple line here on the outline, that would be the dry mixed grass. And then in the Cypress Hills country, that is where the moist mixed grass is. And the green on the area, that reflects the native vegetation. And there's the location of it. The photos are courtesy of actually someone that you now have in Saskatchewan that used to be here, Kevin France. So we focused on this area because of the 80% of species at risk rely on this habitat in Alberta, and it's an area of multiple land use pressures. There's a lot going on as well. There's also a very strong ranching community, so it was going to be quite compatible to get some engagement with the folks in that area. So the first thing we did was engage some partners, because what we didn't want to do is just go into an area and let's build something brand new when there's actually a lot of great work being done. So we really engaged with folks that are working in the area and have that expertise about the habitat, about the community. We also, because you can imagine when you get agrologists and biologists together, especially if we're looking at developing a tool that could be market-based, it's pretty important to have an economist involved. And so she was from Alberta Innovates and was integral to the project. Also just draw your attention to Dr. Gates from the University of Calgary. He participated in the pilot, and he's actually the one that shared and trained us in utilizing this prioritization tool as he used it in other projects himself. We engaged with industry through mainly the oil and gas, wind, and utilities to get their feedback. Would they be willing to undertake purchase of offsets, and how does that work with their business systems as well with landowners? You know, would they be willing to provide offsets, and what would be some of the criteria that would work for them? Of course, we had academia involved and a consultant worked with us who's from the area. So a lot of collaborative dialogue and decision making, and really frank discussion. So it was really a great opportunity just to get that feedback with the variety of partners in order to deliver this pilot project. So based on the initial pilot team discussions as well as our engagement with landowners and with industry in the area, we were looking at a voluntary offset for any new industry impacts within the native prairie on the dry mixed grass region, and the northern boundary is the regional boundary here, and then to the left, the dotted line is the dry mixed grass boundary. So for any industry impacts. And then on the other side, having that offset provision to incent conversion of marginal cropland, again voluntarily, to native species mix in the high priority area. And you see the brown circle outlines that. And if you'll notice the dotted line outlining the area that was obviously drawn by biologists and agrologists. So those were the high priority areas that were identified. So the brown that you see in there, that is the grassland vegetation. So what was really interesting, both at the pilot team, industry, and landowner groups, while the focus might have been on one or two species that were in the news, the consensus of all those groups was that we really wanted a habitat or multi-species approach, because this landscape, we need to be integrated and just ensuring that we're looking at all values versus just one or the other. So we had 4 pilot objectives, and the one I'm going to talk about today is how we developed an approach to target those voluntary offsets on private agricultural land parcels. Because as we discussed around the pilot team, there's at least 15 different opinions on who would choose where those offsets would go. So we felt collectively we needed to develop an approach that would be very transparent, both to those that would buy the offset, those that would provide the offset, and the public. How are these decisions made? So we felt that was very, very important. So in order to achieve that, with the help of Dr. Gates and the pilot team and others, we looked at developing an offset suitability index. So further to the objective that I just stated, we wanted to target to those cultivated lands with the greatest habitat suitability for species at risk and other key criteria. Because as most know, you never have enough funding for what you'd like to do. So how would we be very focused in order to achieve those outcomes? Just draw your attention to the yellow circles on the map there. And again, this is in the southeast area, just right around that Many Berries area. And not all cultivated lands would potentially have the same habitat value. The one circle to the lower right is right adjacent to large areas of native grassland, so that's likely to provide more value than perhaps an offset in this more intensive cropped situation here. It's just a way of being able to rank them. So as part of that development, the overall, again, as I talked about, was consistent, objective, and science-based, using the data that we do have, as well as the expertise with the team members as well. So we held a first workshop, brought everyone together with looking at that particular area to identify important factors to achieve the outcomes. And you know yourself, when you're making a decision, you're weighing multiple different things in your head that you think would best achieve that outcome. So when this was a way that we bring that all out to the forefront, have that discussion, record those on the map, and also as part of a table. Then after that, our GIS teams, again, that was an integrated approach with 2 teams of GIS specialists. So looking at what we have for data that would support those factors, and then undertaking a follow-up process with the participants of the first workshop. So as part of that, and I'll go into more detail as to what these processes look like in real terms in the next project. But just to describe the Delphi, how close would you want an offset to particular factors such as native prairie or intensive land use? The analytical hierarchy, for those that you may be familiar with that, is just comparing each to the other and seeing which one is more important on a scale of 1 to 9. Because that way we are able to essentially build a GIS layer cake which prioritizes which of the factors are more important. And ultimately, following that GIS analysis, we get a final decision support map. So while the workshop was communal and everybody brainstormed and brought their ideas to the forefront, on the Delphi and analytical hierarchy process, everybody did that themselves. So people were really comfortable stating what their true preferences were, not what they may thought others would be thinking was appropriate. So we really wanted to make sure we could get at what the true values and expertise of the individuals participating. So with the results, we ended up with 17 ranked criteria. Number 1 across the board, it didn't seem to matter across what discipline, was ensuring that the offsets would be located away from high land use intensity. Native prairie, adjacent to native prairie, or native prairie block, and in this case that was 4 quarter sections in any configuration. And as well, you can see from the list, there's quite a variety of different criteria that were important to folks, including things as the land suitability rating, different management types, and critical habitat for wildlife. But we also didn't exclude the riparian, lentic, or lotic area. So one of the first maps we have here related to our outcome of being able to target those cultivated lands that would have the most potential for offset provision and suitability. So the dark green represents those that are most suitable based on the ranked criteria, and the red are the least suitable. And in this case, those reflect high-value lands under irrigation, different communities, so lands that are under more intense land use. So what you'll see is the pink area down in the far southeast, because you may be wondering, well, why isn't that whole area dark green? That is actually public land that's all under grazing disposition. So the next map I'm going to show you that we also were able to develop through this looks at the privately held native prairie, because it's felt in some sectors of the offsets that it would be additional to help to conserve well-stewarded land with private landowners because it's at risk of land use change. So in this case, you can see far more green on the screen, as those would be the highest priority areas. If landowners wish to participate, it would make us those decisions a little bit easier by focusing in the dark green or green areas. You generally have more participants than you have money, so this would be a way that we could really be fair as to why certain projects would be chosen over others. And it was very interesting when the industry saw this map. They said, well, you know, that's actually a great tool, for example, for oil and gas to avoid those particular areas, because if you're wanting to offset industry impacts, it's really important that you have areas where you're also not creating more impacts. So this was really helpful to us in that process to test this. And as a result of that, we of course gave presentations, and that led to our next project. So we actually were approached by 2 municipalities in Alberta, and I'll focus on the work we did with Red Deer County. And we worked with Kim Lewis, their coordinator, and Matthew Mulheiser, their GIS specialist, because the whole intent was we wanted to build capacity with the use of this tool, that we could teach others how to use it and they could use it in their own decision making as they see fit. So with the Alternative Land Use Services group in Red Deer, and that consisted of farmers and ranchers, agricultural service board members. We had representatives that were from Cows and Fish, from Alberta Conservation Association, and Ducks Unlimited, and others. So it's a real multi-stakeholder group. And they were experiencing the real success of their program. You know, they had finite funds, but they were seeing more and more interest in the program. So how are they going to effectively compare these projects to the other in order for the outcome that they were trying to achieve? So they really essentially wanting to achieve really good bang for the buck, but also using a process that was science-based and transparent. So again, we asked them to develop their outcome statement of what they're trying to achieve, because that makes it a whole lot easier when you're picking out what the factors are to achieve an outcome. So it's on those riparian areas on agricultural lands with greatest potential to increase ecosystem services, because that's what they are paying landowners for. And there's been a lot of interest in the riparian conservation in that area. So we held the first workshop in Red Deer, and we had each person provide the two most important factors. Well, we ended up in a really great brainstorming session. So there was over 55 different factors that were identified. And we viewed that as a really good result, because people were really teasing out what was important going into their decision making. We then looked at all those factors, and some of them were pooled together. There were common themes. And then we saw what we had available as far as GIS, or Geographic Information System, data and maps that could support that. We also, and it was really important to the team, to identify the factors that didn't have GIS options, because those would also be used in their decision making. So in each case, we had a list of all those factors, and they had an additional list with the ones without GIS options, because as they get down to the individual projects, they would use that as further criteria for evaluation. So after that, we held a second workshop, because it's a lot easier to do in a group setting and people can answer the questions while still having that ability to participate anonymously and privately in your answers. So again, we did the analytical hierarchy. They were comparing each factor to the other, and I've got a couple of examples of kind of the worksheets we used. And then the distances of each factor on a scale of 1 to 9. And following that, we did the statistics. In this case, we came up with 11 factor maps. And I will have some examples that I can show you. And the final presentation. And all throughout this process, it was going back to the group, being clear about what was recorded, what was grouped together, so they could track where the decisions came from. Because in some instances for other projects, when there is information presented, people didn't know where it came from. So there was perhaps more distrust of it. So part of doing this is also people can go right back to the beginning and see where the ultimate outcome came from. So this is a spreadsheet for the analytical hierarchy in each case, and they did have definitions for the acronyms. So what they had to do was bold the particular factor that they felt was most important, and then rank it on a scale of 1 to 9 as to how much more important it was than the other factor, or in fact, whether it was equal. So that was the first part of it. And that helps determine the order of the layers and the importance that will be shown in the final map. So the other questions that were asked, and there's an example, how close should an ALICE project be to a water body, including streams and wetlands? So we asked them to look at what is the most suitable as far as where you would place that project, our ALICE programming. And that was within 100 meters, this participant felt it was most suitable. And going, in this case, to 300 to 500 in that kind of a gradation. And this determines, when you see the final map, where those actual suitability boundaries are. And least suitable in this case was 60,000 meters, which was the boundary of the municipality. because those folks felt that anything that was in the municipality was of value, but most suitable was in that 100-meter range. So following that, we completed the statistics and analysis of that and pooled the results. Then we also took the next step to evaluate it for outliers, and they were identified. So part of that is we didn't make the decision on that. We took that back to the participants and showed them, here's what the results are, and here's where it occurred. Again, anonymously, no one was identified, and put the decision back to the group as to how do we deal with those outliers. And in this case, this municipality, they chose to remove the highly variable entries. Then we recalculated the statistics and produced the maps and the final decision support map. So I'll just show you a few of the layers that we had. So it was one of the factors that was really important was wetland density and classes and stream orders, and all of them. Some areas have focused on just the large ones. They wanted to show the diversity and the extent of all the wetland classes. But you can see that if this was the only map you were using, it probably wouldn't be helpful on a prioritization basis. For example, the brown areas, they reflect those that are the highest priority. The purple are the least. So with 3/4 of the municipality is viewing high priority, that perhaps would be a bit of a challenge to focus. So we use the provincial wetland inventory and the ordered stream network. So many of these layers are actually a compilation of different GIS data put together. So the next one was a scarcity of the habitat or landform, because riparian areas and water quality were important, but so came out of the process were wildlife and wildlife habitat. So we used the ecological significant areas, and again, the dark brown areas, those were the most suitable areas, moving out to the least suitable areas in the purple. Another consideration is if you're spending good money on projects for ecosystem services, it's probably a really good idea that they don't go under pavement or another use within 3 to 5 years, especially when you're looking at maintaining that over time. So it was really important to the group to look at the resiliency against conversion to acreage or urban development. So we used a variety of layers there, the built-up zoning, and in this case, the municipality had that information. So looking at the dark brown areas, those were the ones that were most resilient against conversion and could be focus areas, and that was one of the layers. Another one, which I thought was really interesting with this group, not only for agriculture and the ALICE program to be doing good things, but also having the opportunity to be seen doing those things so that they could be showing the value to society. Now this map, which is not unsurprising, is quite linear as we focused on where those built up areas are. This white area is the city of Red Deer, and these are the main highway and secondary corridors and other small municipalities. So of course, having a project right in or right on the highway is not appropriate. In this municipality, they felt that sweet spot was in the 400 meters within either of those features. So we blocked out the areas in white where a project would absolutely not be on. And then, as you see again, in the purple, those were least suitable. But it gives some criteria of where some of these projects could be placed as part of the factors. So now here's the final map. I just showed you a few out of the 11 to give you a little bit of a taste. So these were all ranked and put together, and this is the ultimate final map. And in the areas, again, same thing, dark brown is the highest and most suitable in these areas, and then also to the left. So we didn't predetermine what the group was going to use it for. That's ultimately the determination of the group itself and what they'd like to use it for. Many of the folks around the table were elected. How do you explain to your neighbors why they got program funding and another didn't? So this is a tool that could help that. But they also looked, instead of just saying, well, if you're in the brown area, you get funding, and if you're not, you're out. They chose a very innovative approach of looking at 75% cost share if you were in those very highly suitable areas, 50-50 if you were outside, and 20-25 cost share if you were beyond that. So they still were at the point where they wanted to encourage people to participate, and they were creating change on the landscape, but by focusing the dollars, then they were able to still achieve that balance. So in this area here too, where you see that, the purple, that was also their high value cropland, as well as the highway corridors and many cities and towns. So when we brought this back to the group to get their feedback, it resonated with them, and they felt, based on their knowledge and the whole system, that this would really be useful to them and reflected their values. So feedback from them was the way that they ended up using it, and that they did find this very useful to help with focusing their decision making. And the next project I'll go into is not utilizing this prioritization process, but it's also multi-stakeholder and GIS based. That's projects that we're undertaking as part of the Prairie Conservation Forum here in Alberta, but also partnering with Alberta Agriculture and Forestry, Environment and Parks, the GIS specialists there, as well as some of the retired folks and contractors from outside. And I think we really were fortunate for the timing of these projects, because the folks who are recently retired helped develop many of these maps and are just intimately familiar with the intricacies of the development. As well as part of the second project, Prairie TimeScan, we engaged with Analytical and the German Aerospace Center. So you just never know where things may go, but again, a very collaborative process and projects with these two. So ultimately, why did we engage in this project? Well, the grassland and parkland regions, a lot of land use pressures and change. But we all noticed as we were developing presentations, the most recent number for the area of native prairie was from 1995. There was a lot of conversations. Well, how do we know what we have? What do we understand? Is there change? Is it significant? For many folks, whether you're doing conservation programming or working with agricultural producers, payment for ecosystem services projects, things like that, how do you have a conversation? And also with decision makers, if you can't describe things in a way that they can understand, or you don't have a recent number, it makes that conversation a little more difficult. So these landscapes provide, as I know I'm speaking to the choir here, important environmental, economic, and cultural values, and these are just some of them. So it's really important to Albertans and also the wider public and beyond, because again, Alberta is just one component of the grassland ecosystem. So with this State of the Prairie project, we gathered all the experts from within our Prairie Conservation Forum community, Alberta Agriculture, Forestry, and Environment and Parks, and basically they looked at gathering all the land cover inventories that we had and that had been developed over time. Many of them cost millions of dollars to develop and were only for a finite period. But it was important to take what do we have and how can we compare it, and how can we ensure that we're comparing it fairly. In the map here, that's actually the native prairie vegetation inventory, which has the oldest inventory with the least categories. The team felt that was the data set that things should be reclassified to in order to make that accurate comparison. So the yellow in this area, which is also the grassland and parkland area, is that agriculture. The pink reflects the grassland. So that was the initial start of the State of the Prairie project in order to compare what do we have now, and utilizing some such as the annual crop inventory on the federal agriculture side, which was very helpful. So part of that process was to, for example, this is just one of the data sets. It had 9 categories. So again, reclassifying that into the 6 so we could effectively compare it. And then following that, they also did a further comparison looking at the percentage of native vegetation. So with the second component, that part of the project that ended up running concurrently, and that resulted from some of the team members going to a presentation at the University of Alberta, where the representatives from the German Aerospace Center and Analytical were giving a talk about these remote sensing temporal statistics that they were utilizing to evaluate land use change. So we thought that might be an interesting opportunity to consistently quantify land cover into the future and cost effectively. I mean, certainly as part of this project, we were very fortunate to get the data for free, but essentially this is something that could be consistent over time and ensuring that it's cost effective, because it's also compatible with new satellites that are coming on stream. And what was interesting, the German Aerospace Center folks, they just wanted to see that it could be utilized for land use planning in other areas of the world, that it provided some value. So what we also did was use what we have in Alberta called the Grassland Vegetation Inventory to test the accuracy of that particular pilot area. So we got data for the entire province. We chose a pilot area, and we were just checking for the native upland vegetation and then doing a comparison with the traditional satellite imagery as well. We did the same process as with the other. In order to compare apples to apples, we took all the TimeScan map codes and compared them to the GVI, and we had a similar classification. So in this case, we're focusing on the native upland, high, moderate, and low, and some of the bare you will see in the next slide here. But those three, the 4, 5, and 6, those were the ones that we compared with the GVI. So the 3-year TimeScan results, and up in the upper left, we have 2014 and 2016. The white represents the pilot area, which was near Lake Newell and just south of the Red Deer River. We wanted to have that comparison to see if we could make inferences that it would be similar for other parts. So that was our test area. And you can see 4, 5, and 6 are the native upland, as well as the yellow, which is the bare ground. And for those folks that remember the 80s, this was also a very, very dry period. So that's why some of the vegetation may also have shown up as bare as well. So it was very interesting. You can see a change over time. What we did find interesting, you'll see the striations here and why that striping occurs. It was a different business model where it was user pay, so there wasn't near as much data collected. You'll also notice something that might be inconsistent with assumptions about southern Alberta. This ended up being classified as wetland or water, and that was really created a very interesting discussion amongst the team. And so, because of that, you can see previously it was very high drought in the area what the record showed. And then I'll just have from our Agricultural Climate Information Service that for the growing season, it was extremely high precipitation during the growing season, as well the overall yearly precipitation relative to long-term normal was very, very, very high. So that perhaps could explain some of that difference. But again, they're still following up with doing some of the final adjustments on that. Now I'll talk to you about some of the numbers. And what we wanted to do is TimeScan. Okay, we were able to get that data for free. We know we can utilize, it'll be compatible with information remote sense that we'll get in the future. But how does that compare with the traditional inventories that we had? So the pink refers to the loss. The area above the black line, that is the parkland, and below that is the grassland. The no change is yellow. It also reflects the native cover. Gain, green, very difficult to find. There wasn't very much of that at all. I think within the error. And then the gray area is just area that was essentially less than 50% native prairie. So most of that gray area is under different land use. So we had an overall change of cover with both of the approaches. In that grassland area is approximately 9.6 million hectares. With the TimeScan approach, looking at the difference between 97 and 2015, that showed a much higher loss, right around 10% or 970,000 hectares. But again, you remember in the previous, it also showed a lot of that land converted to water. So that having some skepticism about that result. With the traditional inventory, and there's a lot of subject matter expertise that has gone into this, there's a little more comfort with that. We saw about a 2% change in the grassland area, and that's about 190,000 hectares. Within the parkland area, right in this upper area here, within the TimeScan, that was about a 4.4% loss, 260,000 hectares, and that's with the pink here. And in the inventory, with the traditional inventories, we saw that more in the neighborhood of 9%, or 530,000 hectares. So the work of the team is looking at what the error is, how much confidence do we have in the numbers, and it's very interesting what the feeling of the team was, that certainly there's more consistency and transparency over time, and we'll be able to get this data into the future. With the traditional, we certainly had comfort with the numbers coming out of that, but we may or not likely to have access to as much data in the future. Certainly, we're going to have the prairie crop inventory. We hope the federal agriculture folks will keep doing that. But these remote sense tools are something that are going to be very helpful to us in the future. And the subject matter experts, they felt those parkland numbers were probably a little bit more accurate in the traditional inventory. So this was of real interest to our group, and just they were very pleased to see that we could get some comparisons, see what the percentages were, that they weren't orders of magnitude, but also giving us a much better number to have discussions about where we're going with conservation, with different private land stewardship for ecosystem services. So there'll be more to come on this, and there will definitely be some technical papers that will be put out. They'll be available on the Prairie Conservation Forum website as well, probably through our ministry. We'll have a link. If not on a site on our ministry, we'll definitely have it on the Alberta Prairie Conservation Forum. So in summary, these tools are very helpful in decision making. We've got the balance of the science, but also the subject matter expertise and the values of the participants for that outcome. There's buy-in for the outcome, and they can see the real process. These approaches are also very helpful and cost-effective for extent and change over time. So we're all talking about the same thing and sharing consistent numbers, because that really came forward with all of our groups. Well, how do we talk about different initiatives when we might all be using a very different number, and understanding what the change is on native prairie and parkland over time. Again, transparency and consistency, it's really important. People need to know where the numbers come from, how it was done, and that it's very fair in its approach. As well, it helps support initiatives to maintain those large native prairie landscapes and effective program delivery. We can make a case that, if we say there's ecosystem services provided by grasslands, including very important economic, social, ecological, and cultural, here's how we can have that conversation. We have the information, and we have it in a format that people can understand, as well as the information behind it to back it up. And here's a couple of views from the southeast and the southwest of Alberta, and I'm very happy to entertain any questions. I just want to give a little caveat. I am not the GIS expert, but I can certainly put you in touch with those folks who can really go into detail about the methodology and approach, and they're currently developing those documents. So yes, any questions?
Hi, Karen. This is Caitlin again here. Thank you very much for the really informative presentation. It was really interesting. It's amazing how much work has been going into this project here, or these projects, I should say. I would just like to remind our listeners out there, if you have any questions, please feel free to type it into the question section of the webinar dashboard. Our first question is, someone would like to know a little bit more about who's funding kind of the inventory side of things.
Okay, and actually, that was quite interesting because, as you know, nobody has a lot of money. Most of this was done through in-kind support for the State of the Prairie. The State of the Prairie overarching project is in-kind support, and we did have some consultants working, but very cost-effectively, shall we say. They're very glad to be involved in it. So with the other project, State of the Prairie, it was approximately $10,000 from our ministry. It was approximately just under $10,000 from the Prairie Conservation Forum. The majority of this was provided through in-kind support. The majority of the funding went to get the analytics done through Mapera Inc. A lot of the other data sets are publicly available. So what we've been able to do in these projects has been leverage public data sets through our collaborative relationships, and then just where we need to engage with someone outside, just put a few shekels together in a collaborative way. So I'm really pleased that we've been able to do these without having to cost an enormous amount of money. So I'm not sure if that answered the question, but essentially, majority of the inventories are available publicly. And the others, we were able, as part of the pilot project, to get that information, the temporal statistics, we were able to get that for free.
Thank you. Our next listener would like to know, what are some of the challenges you had in bringing groups together to work on the State of the Prairies?
Actually, we had tremendous support from all across. Everybody was really interested in knowing what we have. Like, our Prairie Conservation Forum is an extremely diverse group, but we're very committed to all being part of the solution. So everybody brings that forward. We really are able to focus on what we can do together. And so because of the relationships that have been built, the GIS folks talk to one another. Some of us are on the Prairie Conservation Forum. So it was through that, really that professional and organizational relationships that were built, and reaching out. When we found out, oh, Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute, they have some information. They're also part of our forum. So we just brought people in. It was very collaborative. I have an extremely long list of those folks that were involved or even participating in that way. So I think the biggest thing was keeping an open mind, and if any challenges, it was just, I think, understanding what people brought to the table. I think initially, what would agriculture bring to a prairie, understanding prairie conservation, or that kind of GIS. But once they understood, they spoke that common language. They had access to different data sets. One of our GIS people here, he was actually part of building the data set. So that really got things going. Then people got really excited with what they could do with all these multiple data sets and their expertise. So this group has just really taken off.
Thank you for that answer. We have a listener named John from Veresco Solutions. Hi again, John. I'm glad you're able to tune into our webinar. So John says, thanks for the presentation. Very interesting and useful project. And he would like to know if any thought has been given to applying economic values to the ecosystem services to model financial impacts of land use change over time. And he realizes that this is a large undertaking, but it could be a very useful application.
Yes, it sure can. And there is a group that has been working on this, that our agriculture and forestry and others have been providing subject matter expertise to, and it's work on the valuation of ecosystem services from agricultural BMPs, and from my recollection, there's around 15. So an economic analysis is included as part of that. So what is being done and that is with Marion Weber from Inotech, they're now calling it, Wenhong Yang from the University of Guelph, Scott Jeffrey, who's doing the economic analysis, and his students through the University of Alberta, as well as multiple other stakeholders, including our irrigation and farm water, who had a lot of the water quality information and data, and from environmental stewardship branch, when we're looking at the representative farm. So that very much was doing an economic analysis of the BMP adoption. Part of the modeling exercise, and they were looking at water quality and quantity, ecosystem services BMPs for water quality and quantity, biodiversity, and also for carbon. And so what Scott Jeffrey and his graduate doctoral student have done, looking at all the BMPs, looking at what the costs are on this typical farm if they were adopting them, and taking that the next step. Because certainly there were some that maybe cost $1 an acre for a producer to do, or maybe their net benefit was about $1. So it was, because in many cases, a lot of these ecosystem services, they're provided by, and privately, at private expense and public benefit. And then there were some other BMPs that, you know, they cost $200 per cow, for example. So those aren't going to be very effective. In that case, that was a complete set aside of lands. So for us, and especially from our ministry perspective, you have to have that three-legged stool of economic, ecological, and social. So that's one project that I would draw your attention to, John. That could be very helpful, and I know there'll be some presentations in Alberta coming up on that here this spring. But Marion Weber is the key principal investigator, and I know she'd be happy to talk about that.
Thank you for that answer. Our next listener is Romain from France. So, wow, thank you for tuning in all the way from France. And he says he really liked your presentation and would like to know if you intend to help decision-making about weed management with your system.
I think that would be, I think the utility of using a tool like this really is, there's a lot of opportunities. And I think as we've been presenting it and utilizing it, people see more uses for it. I think that would be a really great idea to do that, especially with the municipalities are charged with looking after the weed control. So that's something that would be a really good idea to present more formally to them. And I know we have contacts within our ministry that work on invasive species. And what's interesting as well, this process is also being used under the new Canada Agriculture Partnership for our strategy and program delivery for environmental stewardship and climate change. So again, this is a way to help prioritize. But thank you for that, Romain. I really appreciate that. And yes, weed management that's an excellent idea.
Thanks for that answer, Karen. Our next listener would like to know a little bit more about the Prairie Conservation Forum in terms of how was it initiated and how does it get funding?
Okay, that's a good story. Well, this was back in the 80s, and it's funny, I have that chronology somewhere in my emails here. Ian, who just retired from our organization, it was initially spearheaded through the government of Alberta and looking for prairie conservation. And how it has evolved over those many years, there's the multi-stakeholders. It has had government funding from parks and environment, as well as some smaller funding from other groups, or a lot of it has been in kind. So it has a long history, and a lot of it is through the dedication of the members themselves. And some of those folks were very, very good at making sure that the forum was funded over time. It's also been a priority within the government of Alberta too, to make sure that there is funding for this. However, as we all hear in the news, we have less and less funding. So what our organization has done is we've been doing a casino circuit. So every year and a half, we get an opportunity to do a casino, and we get about $70,000 for that. And it's targeted to specific things and outcomes identified within our Prairie Conservation Action Plan. So while we've had some very good funding from government, we've been very strategic in looking how can we build other networks, other opportunities to ensure we have the funding. We're just going to be having a board meeting next week, and we're going to look at how do we leverage what we have with our partners. And so we've been very focused in what our three main outcomes are and how we want to move these initiatives forward, and why it's really critical that we bring collaborators, because some of the projects that we've undertaken with State of the Prairie, I mean, we've done those in cents on the dollar just because of the collaboration that we've had. So did that give you enough detail?
Yes, definitely. Thank you for that answer. I would just like to remind our listeners out there that if you have any questions, just type it into the question section of the webinar dashboard. I'd also like to remind everyone to check out the upcoming events section on the PCAP website. That's www.pcap-sk.org. And you can click on upcoming events or communications. We also have a Native Prairie speaker series that has webinars every month. This presentation has been recorded and will be uploaded to the PCAP YouTube channel later today or tomorrow. It doesn't look like we have any more questions coming in, Karen, so I guess with that, I'd like to say thank you very much for the really interesting presentation and all the detail that you provided. And I'd also like to thank our listeners too for tuning in. And when you leave this webinar, you'll receive an email with a quick questionnaire. If you don't mind filling it out, it'll just take a minute to answer that, and it'll help us get funding to keep webinars going on in the future. There is Romain typed in again, said thank you very much for your answer. And he worked on Medusa head management at Utah University for his master thesis. So interesting. And Romain, if you'd like to connect with Karen, she's got her email posted there. So you're welcome to connect with her for more details.
Yes, absolutely. I encourage everyone. I can connect you with information on the Prairie Conservation Forum and initiatives we've done here. So don't hesitate to email me. I'm very passionate about all of this. So I strongly encourage that. Thank you.
Well, thank you again, Karen, and have a great rest of your day. And thank you again to our listeners. So take care, everyone. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.